I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. We are coming up on the end of our time at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in dry dock number 3. And while we've been here, we've gotten a ton of questions about the reserve fleet. And we've talked about them in the past and how we're able to get parts off of them to supply the historic fleet. But we've also got a lot of questions about what spaces used to be reserve fleet, what the difference is between various types of reserve assets. And so we're going to talk about a little bit of that in today's video. The reserve fleet really has two separate things. The reserve fleet proper is former Navy warships, and they're administered by NAVSEA, or Naval Sea Systems Command. Many of the ships you see behind us are warships in the reserve fleet. There's also the National Defense Reserve Fleet, which are not ships that serve in national defense like the warships here. Those are the more merchant type vessels that are administered by MARAD, or the Maritime Administration. Warships in the reserve basin often require a lot of work before they can be returned to active service. Iowa-class battleships usually required about a year of work before they could be pulled out of reserve and sent to the next combat zone. National Defense Reserve ships can be reactivated between 20 and 120 days, depending on the classification that they're in. So they have a much quicker turnaround. Starting in 1972, there was also a Ready Reserve Force, which is part of the National Defense Reserve Fleet. Those ships can be reactivated in as little as 4 days or as many as 20 days. These ships have partial crews on them, and they're distributed at various ports around the country. Reserve ships are ships that were formerly active, but due to either their age or their expense, they're taken out of service. But they're not disposed of immediately. Their systems are still relatively close to modern standards, so if there were going to be a national emergency, say another war, you could bring ships out of the reserve fleet because it's much quicker to reactivate one of them than it is to build a whole new, let's say behind us we've got Perry-class frigates, Ticonderoga-class cruisers. It would be much easier to reactivate one of them than to build a whole new cruiser or frigate. For example, New Jersey is returned to active service from the mothball fleet on 3 separate occasions as an active warship, and then a 4th time to be turned into a museum ship. Likewise, the National Defense Ready Reserve Fleet does the same thing for merchant-type vessels, so ships that are no longer needed or are starting to get obsolete are taken out of service, they're held in reserve, and they can be rapidly reactivated in the event of an emergency. Ships in the reserve fleet are held in 5 different categories. X and Y are the 2 lowest levels. X is for a conventionally powered ship that's been stricken. She's going to be sold for razor blades or sunk as an artificial reef. So many of the ships you see behind me, such as these Perry-class frigates that have had their numbers painted over, are Category X ships. They're stricken and they're awaiting disposal. Ships in condition Y are the same thing, but nuclear powered. So for example, the aircraft carrier Enterprise is held in condition Y. She is awaiting disposal, but disposing of a nuclear vessel requires a completely different set of steps than a conventional vessel. So Kitty Hawk and Kennedy were condition X. They're ready to be scrapped in Brownsville. Kitty Hawk has been, Kennedy will soon be. They're ready to go. Enterprise still needs some work in condition Y before she can be. This is a temporary status pending future usage. I'm not entirely sure if that would be, say, the patrol craft behind me or the frigates that are slated for sale to a foreign country, where they are decommissioned and then they're going to be taken back out again, or if it's like specifically aircraft carriers are taken out of commission for a period of time while they're getting their reactors converted, and then they're put back into commission. Or possibly it's a ship like Halliburton, which is on donation hold, ready to be turned into a museum ship. So she is held in condition D. She's not being actively maintained for future service, but she is being maintained to be turned into a museum ship if that goes through. At the top of the list, you have B and C ships. Classification C ships are probably like the littoral combat ship or the Ticonderoga class cruisers here in the reserve basin. They are not receiving active work, but they are being maintained in case we get into a war and they need to be reactivated. As opposed to condition B, where they are receiving periodic updates. So if that littoral combat ship, Little Rock, that was just brought into the reserve basin, is getting the same updates as the littoral combat ships in active service today, so that she could be returned to service relatively quickly, that would be condition B. And I don't believe she or any of the other ships here in Philadelphia are in that status, but I am 100% guessing on what the status is of each of these ships. I don't believe it's publicized anywhere. For the reserve fleet, like the ships behind us, they are in two types of places. They are in either reserve fleets or they are in naval inactive ships maintenance facilities. Philadelphia is an example of an NISMF. Doesn't that acronym just roll off the tongue? So people always reach out and say, hey, my city was this or my city was that. So I'm going to go through the brief list of cities that were and still are reserve fleets. It's worth noting that the reserve fleet has drastically reduced over the years. There have always been reserve ships. It is expensive to maintain active ships. So ever since the founding of the country, there were reserve fleets, although they weren't always known as that. Oftentimes, in peacetime, sailing ships are maintained in what is known as ordinary, and that's the wooden equivalent of mothballing, like the ships you see behind me. By the World Wars, the reserve fleet concept really started to coalesce as we built up huge fleets for those conflicts and then drastically reduced in peacetime. So those sorts of time periods are when you see massive reserve fleets, as opposed to now, where we really haven't fought a major naval war since World War II. So we haven't had massive shipbuilding, and thus we don't have massive amounts of ships sitting in reserve. For the Atlantic Fleet, former reserve fleets were Boston, Charleston, Green Cove Springs, New London, Hudson River, Wilmington, and New York. Still active reserve fleets are the James River Fleet and the Beaumont, Texas Fleet. And the Atlantic Fleet has one inactive ships maintenance facility, Philadelphia. In the Pacific, you had Alameda, Columbia River, Long Beach, Mare Island, San Diego, San Francisco, Stockton, home of USS Lucid, make sure you go out and visit her, Tacoma, Olympia, Hunters Point, and you have two naval inactive ships facilities, Bremerton and Pearl Harbor, and one that's still active as a reserve basin, Suisun Bay. Longtime home of USS Iowa before she was rescued and turned into a museum ship. For the National Defense Reserve Fleet, you can see that some of the locations they are in are the same as the reserve fleet, and some of them are unique. So for example, the James River Reserve Fleet, Beaumont, Texas, Suisun Bay, are all still active National Defense Reserve fleets. Former ones are in New York, Wilmington, Mobile, Astoria, and Olympia. The number of ships over time can really be illustrated by the well-kept numbers of the National Defense Reserve Fleet. In 1950, shortly after World War II, there were 2,077 ships held in reserve. In fact, during the Korean War, some 500 vessels were brought out of reserve to be returned to service. And there are a number of periods of time in the 50s, 60s, and 70s where literally hundreds of ships are called back to active service. As recently as the Vietnam War, ships from these fleets were returned to service. By 2003, only 274 ships were held in reserve, and by 2021, there are only 91 ships held in reserve. We no longer have hundreds of ships to bring back if we get into a massive war, or if, say, during the Suez Crisis, hundreds of ships were brought back since the Suez Canal was closed down, and we then needed more hulls to transport stuff longer routes. Well, the other year when the Suez Canal was closed down by Ever Given blocking it, we only had 91 ships in reserve that could be called back. And I don't believe any were actually returned to active service during that particular crisis. So it really illustrates how a lack of a reserve fleet can cause issues for you. While it's not possible to get really close to all the ships in the reserve basin, because the Navy Yard is now mostly a civilian site, you can walk around or drive around large parts of the basin. Now, you may have noticed that in all the videos we've filmed about the reserve fleet, none of them have been on the ships. Stop asking me if you can get on the ships. Obviously, I cannot, and I am not the one who grants permission to be able to get on. These ships do not have full power anymore, and they are not safe to get on board, so you likely will not be able to, unless there are open houses for your museum ship to participate in. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to donate to support the museum. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about us and the channel. Thanks for watching.